Hey y'all, it's Mike with True American Craftsman, and in today's video I'm going to be showing you how I made a walnut countertop by using 5 8/4 walnut boards. They were approximately 8 inches wide, and the first thing that I did was run them all through the jointer to get one good edge and one good flat side. Once I finished at the jointer, I brought all the boards over to the planer, where I brought the thickness down to about 1 3/4 inches. And if any of you have used these Dewalt planers, the only issue I have is that the tube is in the way of where the board comes out. So I use this clamp to keep the tube from getting kicked out all the time. Once I finished at the planer, I brought all the boards over to the miter saw and cut them down to size. For my countertops, they were about 83 1/4 inches long, so I cut 3 boards at that length. Once I got all the boards cut to length, I brought them over to the table saw to finish off the other edge as well as cut each board down to the proper width. And because I don't have an outfeed table on my table saw yet, my wife graciously donated her time to help me cut these down to size safely. I did run into a few issues here where there was a little bit of bowing on one side of the board and it just would not cut straight. So I did lose a little bit more width than I'd like, but I brought out my 4-foot level and was able to finally get a good cut off the table saw. Using Titebond 2, I went and put a generous amount on the edges of each of the boards and spread it out to get a good glue up. Now I was debating on using Titebond 3 or Titebond 2, especially with it being in the kitchen, but I went with Titebond 2 because I already had it on hand and I had plenty of it as compared to Titebond 3. Now if you look closely here, the edge does kind of look like the boards were bowing, but I did go ahead and correct that with using just some scrap wood to get the surface flattened on the edges there, and the glue up went amazing. While the main section of the countertop was gluing up, I started the next 2 sections, cutting one at 21 by 24 inches and the other at 22 by 24 inches. I then took the smaller pieces over to the jointer and got both the edges nice and clean, so that a good glue up was possible. Before I glued up these next 2 sections, I used Total Boat tabletop epoxy as well as the mahogany pigment by Black Diamond to fill in some of the holes that came in the walnut. I let the epoxy dry overnight, and the next day I went and started unclamping the main section of the walnut countertop. No, I forgot to film it, but I did have some holes and imperfections on the main countertop piece, so I did use the same mahogany pigment by Black Diamond and Total Boat epoxy to fill these little imperfections. So I just used a spackle knife to scrape off all the dried glue from the glue up, and then I used 120 grit sandpaper with my Dewalt Sander, the big boy one I call it, to get a first initial clean sanding on the top of the countertop. Now this sander is different than my palm sander because to me it has more power, and it goes in circular motion, so it can really burn through some wood, which is great when you have those imperfections from a glue up. So I took a break from sanding because it was taking forever and decided to glue up the second 2 pieces for the countertops using the same Titebond 2 wood glue, spreading it generously on the joints and then clamping them together. So we decided to do the walnut countertops instead of like a butcher black or a marble. 1, because of the price. 2, because of the amount of effort that you have to put into maintaining it every year. But mainly because of the color that it presents itself after you finish it off. It's super dark and just looks gorgeous. So while the other 2 smaller sections were gluing up, I started finish sanding the main countertop piece, starting with 220 grit, then moving up to 320 grit. Once I finished with the 320 grit sandpaper, I used a little bit of water and maybe a little too much water, but I made the fibers come up So the next sanding, it took them all down because I knew that in the future this thing was going to be getting wet, and I wanted to knock those out now before it starts feeling weird in the future. But I didn't do the next sanding until after I cut out the hole for the undermount sink. So this was the scariest part about the project, was drilling and cutting into the walnut that I spent so much money on. But I went and got a brand new jigsaw because I did not like the Ryobi one I had. This new Dewalt one is amazing. It helped ease the tension of cutting into this walnut. But I measured it about 6 times to make sure everything was all right, and it worked out perfectly. I couldn't be happier. And it did take about an hour to get everything cut, and I think I went through 3 batteries because of how thick this walnut was. But I did get a nice brisket board out of it. So I didn't put the finish sanding into the video because it was just sanding in again with 320 grit. But the next step in the process was actually removing the old countertops. When I was removing them, I found some imperfections in the cabinetry, so I actually had to build some more forms for it so it would hold the walnut countertop, which was no big deal. It just took a little bit more time. As for the install of the countertops, I didn't use any glue or silicone to hold them in. I just used 2 screws, one in the front, one in the back, for the smaller sections, and I think 3 or 4 for the larger sections. And that was really just to make sure the boards didn't slide forward or backwards off of the cabinetry. The install for the undermount sink, this was actually my first undermount sink install, was super simple. I just followed the directions, and it said to use 100% silicone, which I did, and then I found this cool trick online to use some 2x4s and some clamps to hold the tub onto the countertop. Now, I didn't think it was going to be strong enough to hold, especially because of how deep the sink is and how big it is for it being stainless steel. So I did add the brackets in from underneath just to make sure it was good, but it seems to be holding just fine. And for the finish, we were debating between a natural finish or like a polyurethane, and we ended up going with Rubio Monocoat. It was suggested by some of the countertop leaders in the countertop industry, and I couldn't be happier with it. It gave us that awesome natural look, and the water literally just beads up on it if it falls on it. And it says you're supposed to recoat it every year or so, which that's really not that bad for countertops. So I'm super excited with how the Rubio Monocoat came out on the walnut, and I highly recommend it. So I hope you enjoyed the video. The little before and after, you could really see the big difference that the walnut countertops make. I did end up doing the subway tile backsplash to really tie it all in, and made actually a little walnut shelf for the window there. I think this whole project was great. I learned a lot, and it just made our kitchen really come into that Pinterest style kitchen that we were looking for. Hey, so if you like how the walnut countertops came out, go and hit that like button for me. And if you want to see more videos like it in the future, hit subscribe.